I've been involved in pastoral ministry now for about 40 years, and a lot of things have changed over that period of time. The office in the first congregation I served had a rotary telephone, it had a manual typewriter, and it had a hand-crank mimeograph machine. So you see that striking home with you? And that typewriter cut the stencil that you carefully laid on the mimeograph drum. In that time, cut and paste literally meant cutting and pasting. There were no cell phones. There was no internet or social media. There were still 3 channels on my TV set. So much has changed in so many areas of life over that 40 years. But some things have not changed. When I first started ministry, one of the areas of possible conflict in the church was whether the pastor was going to preach on salvation or on social justice. There was a lot of conversation about the theologian Karl Barth's advice to preach the Bible in one hand and having your newspaper in the other. And that's still a hot point in the church in 2017 as much as in 1977. And no text from the Bible brings those words, brings those feelings to the surface quicker than the reading from Amos for this morning. One commentator wrote that anyone who says they love the writings of the book of Amos probably have not read the book of Amos. It's a hard book. It has a hard message. A lot of work, goes into our planning for our worship times together. Music and messages are chosen to fit a theme that calls us to a time of reflection and then action. And hopefully you're here each week because this time together is important to you. And yet, here's what God speaks to us through Amos. I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. I gulp when I read those words, don't you? There's a call here for us to always look at why we do what we do here each Sunday. And even deeper than that, there's a call for us to always have in our minds that salvation and social action are both components of a strong faith community. Jen shared that a minute ago with the children, how important it is to be the hands and the feet of Jesus going out to serve the world. That's where God is found. Here's another way of framing the issue. If we're going to claim to be Christians, to be followers of Christ, well then we better start acting like it. We just celebrated 500 years of the Reformation. And one of the articles of belief that we stand on as being part of that Reformed family of Christians is that we're saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. Those are powerful words. They're words that have changed the world. And when we talk about preaching a message of salvation, those are the words that are the foundation of any sermon. And they're good words for us to hear, right? When you're struggling with life, when it seems like your world is falling down around you and you're racking your brain to try and figure out what in the world you've done to make God displeased with you and treat you this way, you need to hear that God's love has nothing to do with your behavior or your actions. That God loves you no matter what, and that God will be with you no matter what. The challenge is how you and I react to that message in our lives. And that was the focus of Amos' words to Israel. The folks who heard his words had assumed that because they had God's attention, that all was well. Here they gathered together at these appointed times to make sure that all the festivals were observed. They followed this holy handbook of proper sacrifices to the letter. There were well-trained choirs that added to that atmosphere of worship. And the harps, they were a nice addition too. They thought they were in good shape because they were following the playbook. So they left the place of worship feeling that their lives had been justified because the requirements of faith as they understood them had been met. But all was not well. Those in power were neglecting the needs of those who had no voice. In Israel at that time, instead of taking care of the poor, the rich were getting richer at their expense. There was no thought given to doing anything for the greater good of God's people. And the divide between the rich and the poor kept getting wider and wider. But they thought all that was happening during the week. But on the Sabbath day, all these folks were meeting together for worship, and they had all the confidence in the world that they were good with God, and God was pleased with them. So, you can imagine how these words of Amos were received in the halls of power in Israel. A little bit later on in Amos's book, you read about how a priest who was in charge of the official festivals and celebrations and all of the worship services in the temple reacted to Amos. Here's what he told Amos. He said, "Never again prophesy at Bethel, for it's the king's sanctuary, and it's the temple of the kingdom." In other words, how dare you speak a word, Amos, against the king? How dare you show any disrespect to the temple? The king and the temple are the symbols of our greatness. Well, I think we gasp a little when we hear the words of Amos because deep down we know that they could be speaking to us too. What makes Amos so powerful and effective as a prophet is that he gets right down to the issues that people of God need to be dealing with. And then he challenges them to start struggling with them, to seek ways to make changes that reflect God's justice and God's call to righteousness. Or to put it another way, to look for ways that we can let God's light shine through us in ways that make a difference in our world. As Christians living in the 21st century here in the United States, we have a pretty long list of issues we need to keep on the table. If we stand on a faith that God is sovereign, if we stand on a faith that says God is in control of things and that Jesus Christ is Lord, well, how does that faith address issues of homelessness, of mental health care, of gun violence, of taking care of the environment, freedom of speech and religion, national security, international relationships, and the list goes on and on and on. Amos brought a message to those in power in Israel. He said, "Seek good and not evil, that you may live. And so the Lord of hosts will be with you, just as you have said. Hate evil and love good, and establish justice in the gate. It may be that the Lord, the God of hosts, will be gracious." And what happened? Amos was told by the head priest of Israel to keep his mouth shut. Don't criticize the king. It was pretty clear that things in Israel had got turned upside down, that it was the king's sanctuary. It was the temple of the kingdom. And sadly, God's people had fallen into that same trap ever since. Perhaps you're familiar with the story of Eric Liddell, a Scottish sprinter and a Christian missionary that lived in the early 1900s. His life was the subject of the 1980s film Chariot of Fire. You would have seen that. His faith commitment caught the attention of the world in the days that led up to the 1924 Paris Olympic Games. He was England's fastest sprinter, and he refused to run a heat that was scheduled for Sunday, and that actually would disqualify him from his race and would likely cost England a gold medal. A terrible thing to have happen. And the English Olympic Committee tried to pressure Liddell into changing his mind out of his sense of allegiance to the king. Well, Liddell refused, and he stood on his conviction that God came above any king or country or government. So what happened? You'll have to watch the movie. Amos would call us to have that same conviction of faith. I know that there are many people of faith whose names can be mentioned in the same breath as an Amos or an Eric Liddell. Not many of us can claim the strength to take on the kinds of stands that they took in the face of established power and popular opinion. But I do believe that God is always calling us to be aware, that God is always calling us to question and not be afraid to look at complicated issues through the eyes of faith first, and trust God for wisdom and insight. And there are a lot of issues for us to look at. Those issues that concern us and that divide our nation and our world have no easy answers, and we would be foolish to think that there were. But we are just as foolish if we ignore God's call to bring God's grace, to bring God's righteousness, to bring God's justice to the table. We're foolish if we assume that we are right and righteous and everyone else is wrong and faithless. We are foolish if we don't seek good, the good of all, in all that we do. And we're foolish most of all if we underestimate God's love to work in powerful ways, sometimes even in spite of us. What does the Lord require of you? Go. Seek that justice that rolls down like waters, and seek that righteousness that's like an ever-flowing stream. Amen. Would you pray with me? Gracious God, grant us wisdom and courage as daily we seek to respond to your love and grace and live lives of righteousness and justice in your Son's name. Amen.